So now we are this is our second episode of
Episode 2. What are we calling this?
Behind the Podium. A little spin on behind the music.
I like that.
Pretty fitting,
Underneath
right?
the podium, behind the podium, it's something
Well,
like
underneath, depending on your physical mobility. So this
that.
is
Behind the podium.
our second, but our first foray into
Oh my gosh.
Foray. We're how many weeks out from the concert now?
2 weeks from our Songs of Healing and Hope concert, and today we're going to talk about the Foray Requiem, which is kind of the centerpiece of the Songs of Healing and Hope concert.
That beat me to one of my questions. So by the time everybody sees this, we'll be probably a week and a half away. So if you're seeing this, obviously tickets are still available. Grab some of those at birdercorral.com. Got some great discounts going on over there. But yeah, let's get into it.
All right.
So I mean, you said it's the centerpiece. Explain to us what your thought is there. Why is it the centerpiece?
Great. So the concert's called Songs of Healing and Hope, but reflecting back on the history of the Dudley Birder Chorale and also the history of people thinking about life and death and what death means. Every culture's got different views on death. Every religion has different perspectives on that. So the chorale began 48 years ago. This is our 48th season, as a hodgepodge group of singers to perform a requiem mass for one of the Norbertine priests who had died, who was a dear friend of Dudley Birder. I think it was Father Dorf. And so the group got together. They did the Duraflay Requiem, and there were kind of outgrowth of that, like we should make a choir out of this.
Sorry, did you say Duraflame?
Duraflay.
Okay, I thought you said Duraflame.
Maurice Duraflay is a
like
French
the
composer.
artificial log that
No,
you put in your
no.
fireplace.
Anyway, we
Thank
can
you.
edit that out in post-production.
Maybe.
So then every year for many years after that, the chorale pretty much just did a fall concert on All Saints' Day. And All Saints is kind of it's one of the Christian holidays. It's celebrated in the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church and some other Protestant churches to remember those who have passed and transitioned to eternal life during the last year.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Requiem, that title, if you're not familiar with that, it's the Mass of the Dead. So it's basically the funeral service that has been prescribed. These are the readings that you do. This is the music that you do. And so many composers have been fascinated by that. And many of them towards the later part of their composing or after experiencing a personal loss or a great tragedy, kind of that's starting to reflect on why am I here? What's going to happen to me? Not only what happens to me, but what happens to my music, what happens to my art after I'm done with this life. And we have sort of transitioned over the last 2 years after COVID and everything. Instead of calling it the All Saints' Day concert, because that's a very specific date on the calendar and very specific to one particular religion, to broaden that up a little bit, to talk about healing and hope, that we are all searching for healing in our today life and hope for whatever the future may bring, whether that's next week or eternity or somewhere in between. And all of the pieces I picked are kind of composers' take on what something might be like in the future that's not known but hoped for, or there's a certain amount of faith or like predictability but not certain.
Got it. Okay.
And all of the composers kind of take a different take on it. So Gabriel Fauré, French composer, great organist, 19th century. So, he wrote a lot of this Requiem in the 1880s, revised some of it in the 1890s and performed it as 1900. So that's kind of the time frame for that. So he was an organist. So that means that by the time he came to write the Requiem, he had played the official Requiem Mass that the Catholic Church says, this is the music you play for the funeral. These are the chants that are done.
Quick sidebar, how do they decide what is the official?
I think they decided that in the 3rd century, and some pope said this is it, and that's why you do it. So
Got it. Okay.
This, of course, is before Vatican II, if you know your Catholic history.
Can't say
So
that I do.
every Mass would have been done in Latin, and it would have been done with Gregorian chant. So this is what you sing when there's a funeral mass. And every local parish would do, their own little take. But so Foray had already done this. He said he could do it in his sleep. Also as a church musician, as a church organist, that one of your greatest honors is to participate in the celebration of life. But it's also one of the, it's emotionally draining to day in and day out be confronted with the older members of your church passing on.
Yeah, certainly.
And so Foray, he said it wasn't necessarily directly related to this, but just a few years before, both his dad and his mom passed away.
Okay.
So he wrote his Requiem. But one of the things that's different about it is it's less about judgment and hell and, avoiding hell, so you've got to do the right thing. And it's more of making peace and finding happiness in the idea of eternal comfort. So he constructed it very differently. And all of my favorite composers and some of my favorite music are requiems that break the formula or do something wrong, right?
Breathing new life into the...
Yes. Yeah. So Mozart Requiem, one of my absolute favorites, he wrote it knowing he was pretty close to death, and he did some things you're not supposed to do. It was much more dramatic than the classical period. Brahms wrote his Requiem after his mother passed away, and he didn't do it in Latin. He did it in German, and he picked different readings.
Contextually, I'm sure that rocked the boat.
Yes. I mean, this was well past the Reformation, so, there was a little bit more acceptance of that. And Foray's Requiem, he does a couple things differently. First of all, he wrote it at first, and it was only 5 movements. There's 7 movements today, but he called it the small Requiem. And he skipped all of the stuff about, the day of judgment and the day of wrath and hellfire and all of that stuff. And there was much more of a sense of peace. He talked about the happiness that can come from transitioning to an eternal life. One of his critics called it a lullaby of death. And he said, well, I think that's going too far, but we want to be at peace with what's happening in this life and the next life, whatever that may be. So he did a couple things. He changed a few words. I mean, this is orthodoxy. It has to be these words. And he left a few out. So there's one thing about the Lord blesses all of the faithful that depart. And he took out the word faithful. He says, the Lord blesses all that depart. So there was a little bit more universality to it. And at the end, he includes the in paradisum, which in paradise, which isn't from the funeral mass, it's from the burial service. So he kind of broke that rule. And then later, as he revised it, there was a piece about the Liberame, deliver me, God, free me from the burdens and the trials and the troubles. He had written 20 years before, and he slapped that into the Requiem as a movement that really shouldn't be there, but it works really well. There was another movement that he stuck in, which we're not doing, because we're doing 6 of the 7 movements.
Okay.
He didn't write that second movement at the same time, and I don't think it quite fits, but that's just personal opinion, but it's also, the concert can't go on forever.
Correct.
But one of the things that draws me to a lot of these requiems is they take the idea of things ending and put a personal spin on them, or a universal spin, or kind of a more peaceful view of what the end might be like.
Yeah. I think that's. I mean, I was a little lost there for a little bit, but now that you're saying this, now the universality, really parallel with how you want these Songs of Healing and Hope concerts to be.
Right,
Yeah.
Because a lot of these composers, at different times in their life, either through patronage or necessity of worked in churches, and you go back 50 years, 100 years, and more people culturally also were familiar with the flow of how things happened in church. So there was certain accepted universal understanding of these terms and what that means. And so almost all of these composers were like, I love the Requiem, I love the Mass, but I'm going to put my own spin on it.
So that's the content, that's the text, the meaning behind it. Talking about how he's dropping in this piece from 20 years ago into this Requiem. Stylistically and musically, how does that jive, for lack of better term?
Great. So Foray was a beautiful composer, wonderful. But a lot of his pieces were shorter. He's one of the best songwriters. So there's a lot of French art songs that are Foray, that 2-3 minutes long. And he had an unbelievably flowing melodic style. Now, when you think of death and funeral marches and funeral masses and Gregorian chant, it's not these long flowing lines. So at different points, he does it some in the first movement and some in the seventh movement. He's got these unbelievably long flowing melodies to the text of the Requiem that almost make you feel like you're hearing a little snippet of a French art song or an opera thing. We never like to generalize, but in the 19th century, German music had a style, and Italian music had a style, and French music had a style, and just we won't get into how that came to be or why, but
reasons, yeah.
German music tended to be pretty vertical, so you knew where every downbeat was. Dun, 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 dun. And French tended to be more horizontal, so the melodies would flow. And so you have, in the first movement, right after you have this very opening, mysterious kind of like this very, eternal light, eternal life, and it's kind of this dark, mystical D minor section. Then right away, the tenors open up with this long, beautiful phrase, and then the sopranos have this long melody. And one of the things that Foray throws into the Requiem is there's a lot of dramatic stuff, suddenly loud and suddenly soft, and modulations, that's a fancy musical term for switching keys, that you wouldn't expect. Doesn't follow the rules you learn in music theory, kind of wandering all over. So there's this sort of this peaceful, not anchored sort of thing. We think of, this is probably wandering off into too much music theory, but if you go, you kind of have an anchor of where you are. Mm-hmm. And Foray, there's one section where he just wanders a couple pages of, I have no idea where I am. It's beautiful and it's gorgeous, but it's without anchor. So it's sort of like, if there was a theme in my view of how Foray thinks about this, it's not tethered or anchored to what has to be. So he didn't use the text exactly as it was supposed to be. He didn't use the melodies exactly as it was supposed to be.
I like that.
And some of the things float. So like the last movement, it starts and you just hear sort of this beautiful little harp thing going on. And up above it, you have the sopranos all in unison, just floating up on high notes softly. And they're singing about the chorus of angels. So it was really much more of creating an affect of what the choir of angels would be light and high and floaty. And he uses key signatures a lot for that. So that's in D major, but the ponderous nature of things being kind of heavy and wearing you down is in D minor and is in the lower part of the music. So you kind of hear things shift up and shift down to match the text.
Got it. I like that. I mean, I'm like hearing this, I'm thinking about how, everybody grieves loss or they go through a healing process in a myriad of different ways. So there's that cool symbolism and parallelism where, Foray's writing all this stuff in ways that doesn't necessarily make sense, and it's kind of all over the place. So that's really, really a great connection.
Yeah, that's probably a much more accurate description of grief. We've all, at some point, will lose someone close to you, and, like you lose a mother or a grandmother or something like that, and you go, their pain is gone and their suffering is gone, and hopefully they're in a better place. But I also miss them, and my day isn't as full. So there's this thing, and then, as you get older, and composers, after they've had a personal trauma or lost people, they start to think, well, what will happen with my kids? How will people grieve me? And a lot of composers, they're writing their compositions, just like authors or painters, become like their children. So the Foray Requiem was performed at his funeral.
Fitting.
Yeah. So it's kind of like, you want to make sure that no one else can do it quite the way you do. So you're going to, it's like I'm going to pre-record my funeral music just to make sure somebody gets it right.
Quality control.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, we just have this different way of thinking about grief, and that's one of the beautiful things about choral music and classical music and orchestral music is when you have a larger work like the Foray Requiem that's 20, 25 minutes, and if the full version is like 30, it takes you on a journey. There's a lot of value in pop music or musical theater songs too, but those are more 3-4 minutes capturing a moment or a thought or an idea. And sometimes these larger works, well, they may be inaccessible to audiences that don't know classical music as well. I think if you come and listen to it and feel that flow of the journey. So one of the things that we'll do in the concert that I think helps somebody listening to something that long is between each movement we'll have a narrator just read what the text is in English. Because the number of people who know liturgical Latin just by hearing it is getting smaller every day.
I was gonna say that's not something I can say that I'm necessarily brushed up on.
Correct,
so.
correct. Especially since Vatican II, even people that regularly attend the Catholic Church don't necessarily know the Latin.
Interesting point though about everybody. I feel like I don't mean to generalize, but folks are very much used to hearing 3-4 snippets of these vignettes of a very specific mood, and to sit down for an hour of music that's constructed in a way that is supposed to feel like a journey is I mean, I'm biased of course, but I think that's really, really special.
Yeah. So we're not doing the entire piece because that's like watching one painting. I mean, if you're an artist and really into art, you can stare and look at a painting for an hour. But for most of us that like art, but we don't quite grasp all of it, I want to walk through the different galleries. And so we have, 6 other pieces. We talked about the Bernstein last time. That's about another 10 or 11 minutes. That's a very different view of things. And then we have some complementary 3 to 5 minute pieces that kind of just have different perspectives on what hope might mean, what healing might mean, what is the journey of what we know in life to what we don't know to what may be out there, maybe not.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at the history of humanity and it's been loaded with people certain that they're right about things that they can't actually know for sure they're right about.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, right.
So is there? You're kind of alluding to it, but I know we'd mentioned last time that All Saints 30 years ago, 92. I shouldn't say we. The chorale performed the Bernstein along with the Foray Requiem.
Correct.
So do you want to speak a little bit to the contrast or complementing aspects of those pieces?
Yeah, they're nothing alike, and it's such an irony that as I put this program together, that then afterwards to discover that Dudley had done the same thing 30 years ago. I think they're not at all alike. They just present competing views. The Foray is a very personal way of grasping with eternal concepts of life and death. And the Bernstein is also a very personal view of just the tension and contrast between the Lord is my shepherd and why are the nations raging in war? Yeah. So Bernstein's inspiration was the Psalms, which is one of the books in the middle of the Bible in the Old Testament. And Foray's was the Mass that he had heard every week, every day, working at the church.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, by default, 2 very different people, 2 very different circumstances. So it should follow. Obviously, there's a large contrast in the pieces.
Well, I think one of the things too is you think about how composers' personalities put a stamp on their music. So I don't know Foray, never met him. Well, he was dead long before I was born.
I would
but
hope so.
When you see pictures or you hear interviews with him, he was very poetic. Everything was very flowing. You know, you listen to a lot of his music, and he had a flair for the dramatic, but it was a little bit more restrained. You know, swelling up and down and things like that. But his music, written in the 19th century, had a certain style. Now, Leonard Bernstein was a much more dramatic, outgoing flair. He was a conductor, you know, world famous, one of the most famous musicians ever, known around the world. And he was also beginning his career at the end of World War II. And so that awareness, and as a person of faith, of the Jewish faith, Bernstein was going through the beginnings of the birth of the nation of Israel and the 6-Day War and all of that kind of thing. So his sense of the dramatic, his reinterpretation of the psalm text, you know, is much more up and down and more assertive and more bombastic, reflecting his personality.
Yeah, and obviously the world at the time. I mean, the whole world, you know, was shaken. So that absolutely makes sense.
The world has always been shaken. I think the difference is by that point, we became aware of how shaken it was in other spots that didn't affect us.
Yeah.
So what's happening, as we're seeing now, what's happening halfway around the globe, you see on your screen instantly, and so it becomes a part of your view of the world.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty much the nuts and bolts of Foray, if I you know, can make the claim. Again, we've got a great programmed.
Yes, October 15th, Saturday afternoon, 2:00. We've decided to do it without an intermission, so it's about 65, 70 minutes long. It's great. You'll be home in time for dinner.
Easily.
So, you know, we know that while we would love millennials and Gen Z to be throwing money at us and buying tickets, that a lot of the people that connect in with classical music are of an older generation, so sometimes putting things in the afternoon makes life easier for them. It's also an opportunity for people that love music to bring family or kids, because that's easier than late night on a Saturday night or things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we got some great discounts going around. It's going to be wonderful orchestra. The Foray will be primarily supported by our great organist, Jeff Verkeilen, and supplemented. We have 5 string players and 3 brass players, and Elaine Moss on piano, and we have percussion. The Elaine Moss, yes. So we have a wonderful orchestra, mostly all the St. Norbert music faculty and a few other local professionals that we love and enjoy making music with, and it's going to be really a delightful program. And some of the other little pieces, too, I think will be beautiful gems that you may not have heard of.
Yeah, especially Oh Love. I think people will be pleasantly
Oh Love
surprised
by
with that one.
Elaine Hagenberg, or Hagenberg. I've never met her. She's a living composer. So it's great to do works of living composers and of female composers, just to say, you know, here's another perspective. And I've done a couple pieces of hers, and she must be a very warm and genuine person, because the music just flows with some lovely melodies.
Excellent.
What we don't want to do is we don't want to speculate based on my personality what my music would sound like, because then people would offer some comments. So,
Say cacophonous. Does that capture it?
Yeah, yes, cacophonous could be a word. Thank you very much. We'll remember that at review time.
Good deal. That's it.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.